So I want to respond to a somewhat provocative video made by Richard Dawkins on the subject of Brexit, not only criticising the decision, but the way that the decision was made and the suggestion that in some way, shape or form we ought to be able to and to revisit and perhaps overturn the decision that has been made. So what I'm going to do is, it's only a 2-minute long video. I'll play you his video in its entirety. But before I do that, I got to find out about this because I'd watched a video by Sargon of Akkad, who made a response to the same video. The nature of my video will be very different to the response that Sargon of Akkad made. Sargon of Akkad did the same thing. He said, look, this is Richard Dawkins' video, but then the response Sargon of Akkad has made is basically just saying why he thinks Brexit is a good idea. I won't be making that video, in part because I was, like Richard Dawkins, part of the Remain camp, not as vehement as Remainer as Richard Dawkins, and I'm somewhat more sanguine about the results of the referendum, and also partly because the arguments that Sargon was making were in many ways irrelevant to the points that Richard Dawkins was making, frankly, regardless of whether Sargon's points were correct or not, regardless of whether Brexit's a good thing or a bad thing. The point that Richard Dawkins was making either stands or fails on its own merits. Okay, so without further ado then, let me play you the video of Richard Dawkins. So you've got 2 minutes of Richard Dawkins, and then I'll start to discuss some of the things that he was talking about.
The British people have spoken? No, they haven't. Constitutional amendments are, or should be, hard to achieve. In America, it takes a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. It's easy to see why the bar is set so high. Unlike ordinary lawmaking, constitutional changes are for keeps. Voters are fickle, opinions change. We have no right to condemn future generations to abide irrevocably by the transient whims of the present. If ever a decision needed at least a 2/3 majority, it was Brexit. Brexit is permanent. It has huge ramifications, complex consequences. The costs and benefits, whatever they may be, and you need a PhD in economics to predict them, will resonate down the decades. So, did Cameron demand a 2/3 majority? Or set a timetable for a second vote after a cooling-off period? Or perhaps give Parliament time to debate the detailed terms, taking expert advice? No, he didn't. Running scared of UKIP, he bypassed Parliament and handed over this massively important decision to a simple majority of ill-informed voters. With full Bullingdon-grade arrogance, he declared, "I'm a winner." For petty party political gain, he played Russian roulette with our grandchildren's future and fell flat on his face. And now we are monotonously told, the British people have spoken. No, they haven't. The polls have been going up and down like a yo-yo. The fleeting opinion on just one day of a slender majority of an ignorant and misled public is now touted as the sacred and unchangeable word of the British people. Not just for the next 5 years, as in an ordinary election, but long after we are no longer around to reap the consequences.
So first off, let me say right from the off that I'm not a big supporter of the idea of referenda or the idea of direct democracy generally. For a number of reasons. I mean, of course, the original reason I suppose that we don't have a direct democracy is because it's just impossible to work. It's easy perhaps to work such a system if you've got a very small community, but when you've got millions of people, it's not possible to do so. Conceivably, with technology such as we have now, we could actually function as some kind of direct democracy with everybody getting a vote on every single issue. But actually, I think that that would be a very poor system. And the reason is that because the average person who gets to vote is frankly of average intelligence and of average understanding of the issues, I would like to think that regardless of which part of the political spectrum that you are on, that the people who actually get to debate and discuss and decide these things, whilst elected by us, are of above average intelligence and are of above average understanding of the issues that are involved. So in just the same way as when I send my car in to be maintained, or when I undergo surgery, that I expect somebody to be of above average skills in those particular departments. The same thing takes place when we're dealing with issues of economics or issues of governmental legislative change. I want the people that are fundamentally going to be involved in that to be above average, which is not the case with direct democracy. Now, one thing that Dawkins plays fast and loose on here right at the beginning is he draws a parallel with the United States and a two-thirds supermajority in both chambers for constitutional change. One thing that needs to be borne in mind here is he's talking about two separate things here. He's equivocating when he's talking about constitutional change, because the constitutional change that's involved in the United States there is a change to the Constitution, which is different to what we're talking about here, which is a more specific thing, which is change to the political processes or the way in which we're governed politically within the United Kingdom. And that is very, very important, because there are lots of issues. You can look at Richard Dawkins' tweets out there or his writings and see that there are issues where he's highly critical of the United States, for example, on issues such as gun control, which Richard Dawkins lauds the idea of a two-thirds supermajority with regard to this, and yet he's very highly critical on the fact that the United States hasn't managed to implement higher levels of gun control, and yet the very reason that they haven't managed to implement that, even though the majority of people in the country want to do it, is because of the way in which their constitution is drawn up, demanding the majority, especially in the upper chamber in the Senate, where you have this rather bizarre set of circumstances from my perspective, where you have these small states with a very small population of between 0.5 and 1 million people that have the same number of congressmen as somewhere such as California, which has nearly 40 million people, such that you can have a bizarre set of circumstances where not just two-thirds of the population want a change, but you could have 90% of the population wanting a particular change, but because it's not the right 90% of the population, that change still cannot happen. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both systems. Now, what I will say with regard to what Richard Dawkins says is that if you don't take that kind of a system on board, because I personally find that too limiting, it's not dynamic enough in the way that I'd like to see the country be able to change and evolve. But when it comes to specific constitutional matters, i.e., because we don't have a written constitution of the form that the United States has, but when it comes to matters that affect the way in which we are governed, such as being a member of the European Union, I agree with Richard Dawkins. On the face of it, it is an absurd set of circumstances, that a decision that cannot easily be overturned, that once it is enacted, that once we have left the European Union, it's not something that you can just change again in 3 or 4 years' time. Oh, we'll have another referendum and see about rejoining, because quite likely they'll tell us to fuck off, right? But this is a decision that is going to last for decades at the very least. And to decide it just on a simple majority of the public, ill-informed or otherwise, at any particular day, at one particular point in time, seems an absurd and somewhat reckless way of carrying on. The problem is that I have with Richard Dawkins' point is that that is what we have done. For good or for ill, that is what we have decided to do. And effectively what Richard Dawkins is saying, it's as if I've gone down the pub with Richard Dawkins for a beer. And I've said to Richard Dawkins, who's buying the beers tonight? Is it me or is it you? And he's saying, I tell you what, we'll decide on the toss of a coin. What do you want, heads or tails? And I've now called correctly, and he said, you know what, really, we should have made that best of 3. Well, perhaps, Richard, we should have made that best of 3, but it's a little bit too late to do that now. I absolutely agree with what Richard Dawkins says, is that in advance of the referendum, we needed to think a little bit more closely. This is part of the problem with referenda generally, which is that people are apt to say, well, we have to go with the will of the people, so a simple majority will be enough, when actually when you're talking about these decisions which are not overturnable, which are not changeable in the future, I think you do need a higher bar there, and yet none of that was considered, I think largely because the politicians involved did not think that they would lose the vote. So I do have some agreement with Richard Dawkins there, and the problem is that this is going to happen again, right? This is part of the problem with this. I don't think we can go back on this, and I think it is wrong of Richard Dawkins in the example of Brexit to try and suggest that we do. We've just got to suck it up for good or ill now. The decision has been made on the terms in which we'd agreed, and we've just got to put up with it. I know there's this discussion, by the way, this is a little bit of an aside, but there is this discussion that I had when I made my previous video with regard to Brexit. People saying, well, it isn't a binding referendum. We should have had a binding referendum. Just let me make it clear in case you're unaware. In terms of the way that the Constitution of the United Kingdom works, we cannot have a binding referendum. Parliament can legislate on anything. The way that our system works is that we just chuck out legislation, and legislation... The way that our legislation works, we don't have super legislation such as the written Constitution of the United Kingdom. Bollocks, that should have said the United States. Legislation just effectively overturns legislation that was made previously, and so it's sort of done in a chronological basis. The more recent the legislation, the more precedence that is set by it. But the one thing that Parliament cannot do is bind the hands of future parliaments or bind its own hands in the future. And that is what a binding referendum would do. And it's a really, really dangerous thing. If you're suggesting, if you advocate such a thing as a binding referendum, then what you're effectively saying is that you think that our Parliament should have the ability to set legislation that cannot be overturned. The same as the Parliament could then say things like, right, we're changing the rate of tax to the top rate or the normal rate of tax. We're going to double it. And we're also going to say that this cannot be changed for 50 years' time, right? Or we're now going to say that this particular group of people will be banned from doing this. And this legislation can never be changed. There is a reason why we do not allow Parliament to bind its own hands in the future, right? It's a very, very part of, in terms of our democracy, one of the safeguards that we have, and that's why you cannot have a binding legislation, a referendum. But I think most people understood that once you have the political momentum that goes with a referendum, that it's very, very difficult to ignore the will of the people once the people have spoken. Okay, and I said that this is something that's going to crop up in the future. One of the things that it's almost certainly going to crop up with will be a second Scottish referendum, whether at the timescales outlined a day or so ago by Nicola Sturgeon or whether it's somewhere a couple more years in the future. I am sure that is going to happen in the future, and I'll discuss that in a minute. But the one that I want to talk about first is something that I agree with Richard Dawkins on. We're both monarchists, interestingly enough, Richard Dawkins and I, which doesn't suggest we think that every country should be a monarchy, or that countries that have an established and working republican system where they're voting for their head of state should go back to being monarchies. Not at all. That's the last thing that I would suggest. But that we have a working, functional monarchy that has given us very stable government for centuries now, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. By the way, this is a subject that I'm very, very interested in. If you want to discuss this with me, this is a subject I'm happy to discuss and to take criticism on. But have a watch of my video, and I'll give you a link to my video on why I think we should remain a monarchy in the United Kingdom. Listen to the arguments that I have to make if that's something you want to engage with me on, please, before engaging with me on that subject. But this is one of these things that, again, is very, very precarious, because all you need is at some particular point in time for it to tick over the 50% marker, for an opinion polls to tick over the 50% marker, that more than 50% of people are against the monarchy, and then there would be calls for a referendum. You have a referendum, and all it takes is just for a fraction greater than 50% of the population to vote to become a republic, and then that decision is made for all time. So you can have a situation that for 99 years out of 100, everybody is quite firmly committed to us remaining a constitutional monarchy, and then just for one of those years, it just ticks over, and we end up being a parliamentary republic as a result of that. That doesn't seem a very sensible way of working, but that is how these referenda function when you just go on a simple majority. The more pressing one then is this business of the second Scottish referendum, and it was Nicola Sturgeon who was demanding this only a couple of days ago now. Maybe I should just give a couple of comments with regard to that, because it chimes in with all of this. We haven't learnt the lesson, of course, with regard to the first referendum and with regard to the Brexit referendum. It will still be, let's all be honest, it will still be a basic majority. And let's be honest, Nicola Sturgeon would be spitting fucking feathers, as would all those independence advocates in Scotland, if it was suggested that 60% of Scots ought to vote for independence before such a big decision, before such a momentous decision would be made, because they know full well that that just makes it much harder for them to get what they want. And yet the same logic holds true. Right, which is, let's be honest, if 10 years down the line of Scottish independence, the Scottish people decided, actually, this isn't working out very well, and actually we've changed our minds now and the majority of Scots would like to rejoin the United Kingdom, let's be honest, we will tell you quite roundly to fuck off, the same way as the rest of the European Union will quite roundly tell the United Kingdom to fuck off. Quite understandably, they'll say, well, you've made your bed and lie in it, and let's be honest, personally, as an Englishman, I wish the Scots well if they get independence. But if they come back in 10 years' time and say they want to be part of the United Kingdom again, it isn't going to happen, is it? So this is a very, very big decision to make. Too big a decision to make on a precarious whim of just one vote potentially going over the 50% marker at one point in time. I do think a supermajority needs to be set for something like that. That kind of ends how I feel about this with regard to Richard Dawkins. I agree with him with regard to a supermajority, with regard to these things, or having staged referenda, perhaps 1 year apart, and you need a positive result in each one, or something along those lines. I agree with that, but it's hard shit, Dawkins, right? We lost that one, so we've got to fucking suck it up and put up with how things are. You can't lose a vote and then say, oh, well, it shouldn't have really been done on those terms, so we need to revisit it. It just doesn't work like that. That ends that part of it. Just with regard to the second Scottish referendum, just three things that I want to mention. The first is that with regard to the first Scottish referendum, I made a video advocating Scotland remaining part of the United Kingdom. Since then, I posted a message on Facebook to a Scottish Facebook friend of mine saying, actually, I've got a little bit tired of all of this now. And to be honest, I don't see an end to this. Until Scottish gets independence, I just see this being an issue. And I'm kind of getting a bit bored of 5 million Scottish people seemingly taking up more than 5 out of 60ths of the time and of the interest, right? It's as if a Scottish vote just classing for one vote amongst 60 million people isn't really kind of good enough. And I've got a little bit tired of the whole issue. He took issue with me regard to that, as if, oh, I'm sorry for boring you with regard to that, right? Can I also say a lot of Scottish people have got bored and got tired of the whole Scottish independence thing as well. If they're entitled to get bored with it all, I think I'm entitled to get bored with it as well. What I would say is that as a result of me getting tired with it, I've altered my position. I actually hope in some ways that if there is a second Scottish referendum, that they achieve independence, because I don't see this. This is another one of these things. If a simple majority all that is called for, we're going to keep having a once in a generation referendum every 4 or 5 fucking years seemingly, and until the right result is made, effectively, until the right result is made, by which I mean the result that you can't go back from, but the result by which you can't hold another referendum and overturn, by which I mean the result for independence. So in many ways, let's just get it out the way. I do find Nicola Sturgeon's timetable somewhat cynical. She could have chosen to hold a referendum date sometime after Brexit has been finished, which will be, what are we now, March 2017, so about March 2019, sometime after that, so as not to complicate matters, as if things aren't fucking difficult enough. Or she could have said, let's have a date as soon as possible, right? So the Scottish people can just make their decision. As it is, what she's called for is a date within somewhere between 18 and 24 months' time. Now, colour me fucking cynical, but that is just that is just calling a date where effectively the Scottish people will be able to pick and choose. 5 million out of the 60 million people of the United Kingdom. If the Brexit process doesn't seem to be going the way that they quite fancy, at that point they'll be able to bail and say, well, we don't really want any part of this. But actually, if it seems to be going quite well, they'll be able to stand stand by it and say, oh yes, we're very much part of this process, let's crack on and finish it off. Right, holding a referendum just at the point right towards the end of the unentanglement, that 2-year process, seems like you're wanting your cake and eating it somewhat. So whilst I can see why Nicola Sturgeon would opt for that kind of date, why wouldn't she? It gives the Scottish people, it puts them in a marvellous position that none of the other people within the United Kingdom are in, of being able to make the decision whether to go for Brexit or not after they know how it's going to turn out. Yes, I'm sure we'd all like to have that, wouldn't we? What I would like to see is for the UK government to play hardball on that and say, no, actually, I would like to see them allow a referendum, but it either takes place in 6 months' time or it takes place in 4 years' time, not at some point in between. What is interesting, if you're interested in the Scottish referendum and how it will turn out, like I say, I'd rather actually we just put this one to bed now. It seems an inevitable thing that's going to happen. I'd rather we didn't break up the United Kingdom, but I sense a certain inevitability towards it, so we might as well just fucking get on with it. But actually, it's not as clear-cut as that. There was a very interesting article in The Guardian a week or two back where they'd taken an opinion poll of Scottish opinions and looked at how people had voted in the first referendum and how they'd voted in the European referendum and where their movements were towards a second referendum. And this was the interesting thing. If I can interpret this graph for you, what it's showing is that there are people who voted originally to remain as part of the United Kingdom but who wanted to be part of Europe, sufficiently so that they will now change their vote and vote for Scottish independence in the hope that they can remain part of the EU. But similarly, there is another camp which the SNP aren't quite so keen to talk about, which are these people that actually wanted to leave the United Kingdom, okay, but actually do want to leave Europe as well. And if it means guaranteeing that they get to leave Europe, they would vote differently in the second Scottish referendum. They'd now changed their vote from leaving the United Kingdom to remaining part of the United Kingdom. Perhaps not least because of the practicalities. You're going to have another very, very difficult border, just the same as we will have in Ireland. Whereas if we're not part of a single economic area, if we're not part of a customs union, what is going to happen at that border? What is going to happen with regard to trade between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom? It's going to be a very, very difficult situation to be in there. So, seemingly with regard to this graph that was shown on The Guardian, more people are actually going in the wrong direction for the SNP's from the SNP's perspective than was going in their direction. What is clear from all of this is massive amounts of uncertainty. And it won't be until the day of the referendum that we will know which way this is going to go. What a parlous position for the United Kingdom to be in. And how irresponsible to suggest that the time that we should do this should be in the last 6 months of that 2-year window. What a fucking ludicrous thing to suggest, even if that is in the best interests of the Scottish people. Okay, that's what I wanted to say with regard to the Scottish referendum, and also what I wanted to say with regard to Richard Dawkins' video. Thanks for hearing me out. Bye for now.